The housekeeper's heroism and the millionaire's forgotten love. The soft patter of rain against the tall windows of the Blackwood estate filled the air as Alina pushed her cleaning cart down the marbled hallway. Her routine had become second nature in the weeks since she started working as a maid for Alexander Blackwood, a man she had only caught glimpses of during his rare appearances in the grand halls of his mansion. The estate itself was a labyrinth of wealth and taste, filled with opulent chandeliers, priceless art, and long corridors that seemed to stretch endlessly. To Alina, it was both a marvel and a stark reminder of the world she had never known, one of privilege, security, and power. "Alina," called Mr. Travers, the butler, his crisp voice pulling her from her thoughts. "When you're finished here, the upstairs dining area needs tidying. Mr. Blackwood will have guests tomorrow." "Yes, Mr. Travers," she replied politely, nodding as she pushed her cart toward the next room. Her days at the estate were a mix of physical labor and quiet solitude. The work, while tiring, gave her time to think, though she avoided dwelling too much on the past. Memories of her small, dimly lit childhood home, her mother's warm smile, and the pendant she had left her were bittersweet. Alina often clutched the small necklace, a simple silver charm she wore under her uniform, when she felt overwhelmed by her new surroundings. By mid-afternoon, Alina was dusting the shelves in the study, a room filled with an air of solemnity and intellect. Stacks of leather-bound books lined the walls, and a massive oak desk sat in the center, adorned with papers, pens, and a single family photograph. She had seen the picture before. Alexander Blackwood, and a woman with dark, wavy hair, her smile radiant as she leaned into him. Alina couldn't help but wonder who she was. The low hum of machinery from the nearby utility room caught her attention, but she thought little of it. The mansion's electrical systems were said to be state-of-the-art, and their occasional whirs and clicks were background noise by now. As she finished her task, footsteps echoed in the hallway. Turning, she caught a glimpse of Alexander Blackwood walking briskly past the open study door. His usually composed demeanor seemed tense, his expression hard as he carried a sleek tablet in one hand. Alina noticed he was heading toward the control unit, a restricted area she had been warned about during her orientation. "Curious," she muttered under her breath, but dismissed it as none of her concern. She resumed her work, moving to the next room. But minutes later, a sharp, guttural yell shattered the quiet. Alina froze, her heart racing. The sound came from the direction of the control room. Without thinking, she dropped her duster and sprinted toward the source of the commotion. When she reached the doorway, the sight before her was chilling. Alexander Blackwood was slumped against the wall, his body convulsing slightly as sparks shot from an open panel. A faint, burning smell lingered in the air. "Mr. Blackwood?" Alina screamed, rushing to his side. His face was pale, his breathing shallow. The tablet lay cracked on the floor, its screen flickering. Without hesitating, Alina grabbed the broom leaning against the wall and used the handle to push the still sparking panel shut, cutting off the flow of electricity. The room dimmed as the crackling ceased, leaving only the sound of her ragged breathing. "Stay with me," she urged, kneeling beside him. His eyelids fluttered, and he let out a faint groan. Alina checked his pulse, relieved to find it weak but steady. She remembered the basics of first aid from a course she had taken years ago. Carefully, she tilted his head back to keep his airway open, doing her best to keep calm. "Help! Someone call for help!" she shouted, her voice echoing through the hall. Within moments, other staff members arrived, their shocked faces a blur as they crowded into the room. Mr. Travers quickly took charge, calling for an ambulance while Alina stayed by Alexander's side. her hands trembling but steady. As paramedics arrived and loaded him onto a stretcher, Alexander's gaze briefly met Alina's. His lips parted as if he wanted to say something, but exhaustion overtook him, and he closed his eyes. Alina stood back, her hands shaking as she watched the ambulance disappear down the long driveway. The other staff murmured amongst themselves, their voices filled with worry and speculation. "She saved his life," one of them whispered. "Lucky she was nearby," another added. Alina barely registered their words. Her mind was a whirlwind of emotions, fear, relief, and an unshakable sense that this day would mark the beginning of something she couldn't yet comprehend. Alina's hands trembled as she folded the cleaning rags in the laundry room, trying to steady herself. The events of the day felt surreal. She'd saved Alexander Blackwood's life, her employer, and one of the most powerful men in the city. The adrenaline that had coursed through her veins earlier was replaced by a heavy sense of unease. Late that evening, she finally allowed herself to sit down in the small room provided to her as part of her employment. Her mind wandered back to the moment she had performed CPR, the electric shock coursing through him while she scrambled to save his life. Her fingers absent-mindedly brushed against the inside of her wrist. There, etched into her skin, was a simple tattoo, a delicate infinity symbol entwined with a rose. It was more than just ink. It was a memory, a tribute. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock on the door. "Alina," came Mr. Travers's voice, calm but firm. She opened the door to find the butler standing with his hands clasped neatly in front of him. His usual stoicism was softened by urgency. "Miss Alina, Mr. Blackwood has requested to see you at the hospital. He's regained consciousness and has specifically asked for you." Her heart raced. "Me? Why?" Mr. Travers raised an eyebrow. He did not say. But when Mr. Blackwood insists, it's best to comply. The car is waiting. Moments later, Alina found herself sitting in the sleek black sedan that ferried Alexander to his many engagements. The drive was quiet, save for the hum of the engine and her racing thoughts. The hospital room was dim, lit only by a bedside lamp and the soft glow of monitors. Alexander Blackwood, pale and bandaged, lay propped up against a mound of pillows. His piercing gaze locked onto Alina as soon as she entered. "You're the one who saved me," he began, his voice hoarse but steady. "I just did what I could," she replied, her words almost apologetic. He studied her for a long moment, as if trying to piece together a puzzle. "Come closer," he said, gesturing weakly. Alina hesitated, but stepped closer to his bedside. He raised a hand, motioning toward her arm. "That tattoo," he said, his voice sharper now. "How did you get it?" Her stomach dropped. "Why does it matter?" "Just answer the question," he pressed, his tone urgent but not unkind. She glanced at her wrist, the ink a familiar comfort. "It's something I got years ago. My best friend and we got matching tattoos when we were teenagers. It's silly, really. Just something we did together." Alexander's expression hardened. "What was her name?" Alina frowned, unsure of where this was leading. "Claire," she said softly. "Claire Summers." The blood seemed to drain from Alexander's face. He exhaled sharply, almost as if her words had physically struck him. "Claire Summers," he murmured, his voice barely audible. "What about her?" Alina asked, a knot of unease forming in her stomach. "She was my wife," Alexander said, his eyes locking onto hers. "The tattoo. I recognize it. Claire and I designed it together. It was supposed to be ours, a symbol of our bond." Alina froze. "That can't be possible. Claire never mentioned being married. She didn't talk about you." Alexander's gaze softened, but there was a deep sadness behind his eyes. She wouldn't have. We parted on painful terms. She left me and I never saw her again. I didn't even know she'd passed away. Alina felt as if the floor had been pulled out from under her. The woman who had been her best friend, her confidant, had lived a life Alina knew nothing about. Why did she leave? Alina asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Alexander sighed, running a hand through his hair. It's complicated. We loved each other, but our worlds were too different. I was consumed by work, building this empire. She wanted simplicity, a life away from the spotlight. One day, she just disappeared. I thought she'd moved on, found the life she wanted without me. But now... He trailed off, his eyes returning to the tattoo. Alina stared at him, her emotions a whirlwind. She was everything to me, she said quietly. After my parents died, she took me in. She was my family. I never knew she carried so much pain. The room fell silent, the weight of their shared connection to Claire hanging heavily in the air. Over the next hour, they pieced together fragments of their shared history with Claire. Alexander shared stories of their early years together, their whirlwind romance, their dreams of a future that never came to be. She never stopped being kind, Alexander said, his voice tinged with regret. Even when things got hard, she had this way of making everything feel lighter. Alina nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. That was Claire. She could find beauty in anything, even when we had nothing. As the night wore on, a new bond began to form between Alina and Alexander, built on their shared love for the woman who had touched both their lives so deeply. The next morning, Alexander requested to speak with Alina privately again. When she arrived at his hospital room, he greeted her with a faint smile. "Alina," he began, his tone serious, "I've been thinking. I owe you my life. And now, I feel like I owe you more. Claire brought us together, in a way, and I want to honor that." "What do you mean?" Alina asked cautiously. "I want to help you," he said simply. "You've been working tirelessly here, living in the shadows. You deserve more than that. Let me give you a fresh start. Better living arrangements, education, whatever you need to chase the dreams you and Claire talked about." Alina blinked, overwhelmed by the offer. "I don't know what to say." "Say yes," Alexander replied with a gentle smile. "Let me do this, not just for you, but for Claire." Alina looked down at her tattoo, the symbol that had bound her to Claire and now to Alexander. She thought of all the dreams she had shelved, all the possibilities she had dismissed. "All right," she said finally, her voice steady. "But on one condition." Alexander raised an eyebrow. "Name it." "Help me honor her memory," Alina said firmly. "Let's make sure her kindness, her love, lives on." Alexander nodded, his expression resolute. "Together, we will." As they left the hospital that day, Alina felt as though a new chapter of her life was just beginning. The weight of the past hadn't disappeared, but for the first time, it felt like something she could carry. Not alone, but with someone who understood. Little did they know, their journey together was only just beginning. The weeks following Alexander's recovery were a whirlwind for both him and Alina. True to his word, Alexander made arrangements for her to move into better living accommodations, a cozy apartment on the edge of the city with views of the park. It was a far cry from her cramped and sparsely furnished room in the staff quarters of the Blackwood estate. "You shouldn't have to live like that anymore," Alexander had said, his voice firm yet kind. Alina found herself slipping into a world she'd only ever glimpsed through the polished windows of skyscrapers, a world of opportunity and stability. Yet, despite her gratitude, She couldn't shake the unease lingering at the edges of her thoughts. Her connection to Claire, now intertwined with Alexander's past, felt like a puzzle with missing pieces. One morning, as Alina unpacked the last of her belongings, a knock on her apartment door startled her. She opened it to find Alexander standing there, holding a manila envelope. "Good morning," he greeted, his usual composed demeanor slightly softened. "I thought we could continue our search. There's something I need to show you." Alina invited him in, and they sat at her small dining table. Alexander slid the envelope across to her. "These are some of the letters Claire wrote to me during our time together," he explained. "I found them in a storage box after you mentioned how much she meant to you. I thought they might offer some clarity, or at least give us a sense of what she was going through." Alina opened the envelope cautiously, her fingers trembling as she unfolded the first letter. The handwriting was unmistakably Claire's, neat and flowing, yet filled with small imperfections that spoke of her emotional state at the time. "Dear Alex," Alina read aloud, her voice soft. "I hope this letter reaches you in good spirits. I know things between us have been difficult, and I don't blame you for feeling hurt. Please understand, my leaving wasn't about you. It was about finding myself again. This world you've built, it's magnificent, but it's not one I fit into." Her voice caught as she continued, the words striking a chord deep within her. "She always felt out of place," Alina murmured, more to herself than Alexander. Alexander nodded, his expression distant. "I didn't see it at the time. I thought providing everything she could ever want was enough, but I failed to realize that what she needed was something I couldn't give. Peace." Alina set the letter down, her thoughts racing. These letters, they're full of her struggles, her doubts, but she never mentioned what she was planning. Why she disappeared. "There's more," Alexander said, pulling another envelope from the inside pocket of his blazer. "My investigator found this in some of the old hospital records." Alina's brow furrowed as she unfolded the document. It was an incident report from a clinic in a neighboring town, dated shortly before Claire's disappearance. Patient, Claire Summers. Reason for visit: medical evaluation, Alina read aloud. Her eyes skimmed the rest of the page, her breath catching at one line. Pregnancy confirmed. The air between them seemed to thicken. "She was pregnant?" Alina asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Alexander leaned back in his chair, his expression a mixture of shock and sadness. "I had no idea. She never told me. If I had known..." He trailed off, his hands gripping the edge of the table tightly. Alina's mind spun, but there was no baby. She never... When I met her, it was just the two of us. She never mentioned a child. The weight of the revelation settled heavily between them. Questions churned in Alina's mind. Had Claire lost the baby? Had she given it up for adoption? Or had something more sinister happened? That evening, Alina and Alexander visited a private investigator Alexander had hired to look into Claire's past. The office was small and unassuming, tucked away in a quiet corner of the city. The investigator, a sharp-eyed woman named Marla, greeted them warmly. "Mr. Blackwood, Miss Alina, I've been going over the records you provided, as well as some leads I managed to dig up. There's a lot we still don't know, but I did find something curious." She handed them a stack of documents. Among them was a receipt from a boarding house in a small coastal town, dated several months after Claire's supposed disappearance. "She stayed here?" Alina asked, her voice tinged with disbelief. Marla nodded. "It appears so. The owner of the boarding house passed away a few years ago, but The records show Claire rented a room for nearly a year. She paid in cash, which made her harder to trace. "What about the baby?" Alexander asked, his tone urgent. Marla hesitated. "There's no mention of a child in the records. It's possible she had the baby and gave it up for adoption, or that something happened during her time there. Without more information, it's difficult to say." Alexander's jaw tightened. "Then we keep looking." Over the next few weeks, Alina and Alexander delved deeper into Claire's mysterious past. They traveled to the coastal town, visiting the boarding house where she had stayed. The current owner, an elderly woman named Mrs. Jenkins, remembered Claire vaguely. She was quiet, Mrs. Jenkins said, her hands trembling as she poured them tea. Always kept to herself. But there was a sadness about her, like she was running from something. Alina glanced at Alexander, her unease growing. "Did she ever mention a child?" Mrs. Jenkins shook her head. "Not that I recall. But she had a habit of walking down to the beach every evening. Maybe she found some peace there." They followed the trail of Claire's final days, piecing together fragments of a life filled with both love and pain. At the same time, Alina found herself growing closer to Alexander. Their shared connection to Claire deepened their bond, and for the first time, Alina felt like she belonged somewhere. One evening, as they stood on the beach where Claire had walked so many years ago, Alexander turned to Alina. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "For what?" Alina asked, her brow furrowing. "For helping me see her again," he replied. "Through you, I found a part of her I thought I'd lost forever." Alina smiled faintly, her hand instinctively brushing over her tattoo. She would have wanted us to find each other, to make something good out of all this. Alexander reached for her hand, his touch warm and steady. "Then let's honor her together." The days following their visit to the coastal town were filled with reflection. Alina and Alexander had found pieces of Claire's life that neither had known existed, but they were still left with more questions than answers. Yet amidst the uncertainty, a quiet bond was forming between them, one that neither could deny. One afternoon, as they sorted through more of Claire's belongings at Alexander's estate, Alina found herself drawn to a small, locked wooden box tucked away in a dusty corner of the attic. "Have you ever seen this before?" she asked, brushing the cobwebs from its surface. Alexander glanced over, his brow furrowing. It must have belonged to Claire. The box was intricately carved, with delicate floral patterns etched into the wood. Alina ran her fingers over the lock, realizing it would take more than a hairpin to open. "We could force it open," Alexander suggested. "No," Alina said, shaking her head. "If it's hers, we should respect it." They decided to take the box to a locksmith in town. The elderly locksmith, a man named Gus, examined it with a thoughtful expression. "This is a fine piece," he said, running his fingers over the carvings. "Old but well made. Give me a few minutes, and I'll have it open." When the lock clicked open, Alina's heart raced. She and Alexander exchanged a glance before lifting the lid. Inside were photographs, letters, and a small journal, its leather cover worn with age. Alina picked up the journal, her hands trembling slightly. She flipped to the first page, her breath catching at Claire's familiar handwriting. "To my child. If you ever find this, I hope it brings you peace. I hope it answers the questions you've carried your whole life." Alina's heart pounded as she continued reading. The journal was a mixture of diary entries and letters, each one revealing more about Claire's life during the time she had spent away from Alexander. One entry stood out, written just weeks before her disappearance. "The truth is heavier than I imagined. Every decision feels like a betrayal. Alexander deserves to know, but I can't face him. Not like this. I've made too many mistakes, and now I'm running out of time. My child will need someone stronger than me, someone who can guide them when I can't. I only hope they find their way back to him someday." Alina's hand shook as she read the words aloud. Tears blurred her vision, and she felt Alexander's hand rest gently on her shoulder. "She was trying to protect us," Alina whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "She didn't leave because she wanted to. She left because she thought it was the only way." Alexander nodded, his jaw tight. "And she carried that burden alone." As they sifted through the rest of the box's contents, they found more clues about Claire's life, receipts, photographs, and a few sketches of a small child. "Do you think these are of me?" Alina asked, holding up one of the sketches. Alexander examined it closely. "They might be. The resemblance is uncanny." That evening, as they sat by the fire, Alina traced the tattoo on her arm, the one she had gotten with Claire so many years ago. "She always talked about wanting to leave something behind," Alina said, her voice distant. "A piece of herself that would last forever. That's why we got these tattoos. It was her idea, and I went along with it because, well, because she made everything feel meaningful." Alexander watched her carefully. "Do you think she ever regretted leaving?" Alina shook her head. "I think she regretted not telling you the truth. But I don't think she regretted protecting her child." Alexander's gaze softened. "And now that child is sitting here, bringing her back to life in ways I never thought possible." Alina smiled faintly, though her heart was heavy. She had spent her entire life wondering about her past, and now that she was finally uncovering it, the truth was more complex than she could have imagined. A few days later, Marla, the investigator, called with news. "I've traced the adoption records," she said. "There's a gap in the paperwork, but I managed to track down the lawyer who handled the case. He's retired now, but agreed to meet with you." Alina and Alexander wasted no time, arranging to meet the lawyer, a man named Harold Graves, at his modest home on the outskirts of town. Graves was a thin, elderly man with sharp eyes that still held a spark of intelligence. Come in," he said, ushering them into his living room. "I was surprised to get your call. It's been years since I handled that case." Alina explained their situation, her words tumbling out in a rush. Graves listened carefully, nodding occasionally as she spoke. "I remember the case well," he said finally. "It was unusual. Most adoptions go through the standard channels, but this one, well, it was different. The woman who came to me, Claire Summers, she was desperate. She insisted on complete anonymity. She wanted to make sure her child was safe, but she didn't want anyone to know where the child had gone, not even the father." "Why?" Alexander asked, his voice tight. Graves hesitated. "She was scared. She mentioned something about family conflicts, though she didn't go into detail. She just said she needed to protect her child at all costs." Alina's heart ached as she listened. "And that's why she disappeared," she said softly. Graves nodded. "She believed it was the only way to keep you safe." As they left Graves's house, Alina felt a mix of sadness and closure. Claire's choices, though painful, had been made out of love. "I think I finally understand her," Alina said as they drove back to the city. Alexander glanced at her, his expression thoughtful. "And do you think she'd be proud of the person you've become?" Alina smiled faintly, her hand brushing over her tattoo. "I think she would." The journey was far from over, but for the first time, Alina felt like she was walking a path that would lead her home. A path lit by the enduring love of the woman who had given everything to protect her. The storage unit's discoveries had left Alina and Alexander grappling with equal parts grief and resolve. Claire's journal, the photographs, and her heart-wrenching letter had revealed a woman who sacrificed her own happiness to shield those she loved. But the truth wasn't yet complete, and the lingering questions only deepened the tension surrounding Jared's possible involvement. Over the next few days, Alexander worked tirelessly, his investigator uncovering more suspicious details about Jared's financial dealings. Payments to untraceable accounts and connections to individuals with unsavory reputations painted a troubling picture. Meanwhile, Alina couldn't shake the feeling that someone was keeping an eye on them. Every shadow seemed to loom longer, and every sound felt magnified. "It's like we're being watched," Alina said one evening as she stood by the window of Alexander's study. "I wouldn't put it past Jared," Alexander replied, his voice taut. "If he's gone this far to cover something up, he won't stop now." The next morning, Marla called with a breakthrough. "We've traced some of Jared's financial transactions," she said. "They lead to a private investigator he hired around the time Claire disappeared." Alexander leaned forward in his chair. "What was he looking into?" "It's unclear," Marla admitted, but the investigator's last known location was a remote cabin near the crash site. Alina's eyes widened. "Do you think it's connected to what happened to Claire?" "There's only one way to find out," Marla replied. The drive to the cabin was tense. The roads were narrow, winding through dense woods that seemed to close in around them. Alina stared out the window, her thoughts racing. "What if this brings us no closer to the truth?" she asked softly. "Then we'll keep looking," Alexander said firmly. "But we owe it to Claire to see this through." When they arrived, the cabin appeared abandoned. The wooden structure was weathered, its roof sagging under the weight of years of neglect. They approached cautiously, their footsteps crunching on the gravel. Alexander pushed the door open, and the smell of damp wood and mildew greeted them. Inside, the cabin was sparse. Dust covered every surface, and the air was thick with decay. But amidst the debris, Alina spotted a metal filing cabinet tucked into the corner. "Over here," she called, her voice echoing in the empty room. Alexander joined her, and together they pried open the cabinet. Inside were files and folders, yellowed with age. Alina's heart raced as she flipped through them. One file caught her eye. "Carter, confidential." She opened it to find photographs of Claire, grainy but unmistakable, along with notes detailing her movements in the months before her disappearance. "He was following her," Alina said, her voice trembling. Alexander's expression darkened as he scanned the documents. "Jared must have hired someone to watch her. But why?" The answer came in the form of a handwritten letter folded inside the file. "Mr. Carter, the target has been located. She plans to leave soon, but she has the child. If you want to proceed, it must be handled quietly. No loose ends." Alina's blood ran cold. "The child, that's me." Alexander's hands clenched into fists. He knew. Jared knew she was planning to leave, and he tried to stop her. As they continued searching the cabin, they found more incriminating evidence. Bank statements linking Jared to the payments Marla had discovered, and correspondence with individuals known for orchestrating disappearances. "He didn't just know," Alexander said, his voice filled with anger. "He orchestrated it. He's the reason Claire disappeared." Alina felt a mix of rage and sorrow. Her mother's sacrifice, her life of uncertainty, it all traced back to Jared's selfishness. "We have to confront him," she said, her voice resolute. Alexander nodded. and this time, he won't be able to deny it. That evening, back at the estate, the tension was palpable as they prepared for the confrontation. Alexander's lawyer reviewed the evidence, ensuring it was enough to hold Jared accountable. "He won't go down without a fight," the lawyer warned. "We're ready," Alexander replied, his gaze steely. When Jared arrived, he was as smug as ever, his confidence oozing with every step. "Summoned to a family meeting, are we?" he quipped, pouring himself a drink from the bar. "To what do I owe this honor?" Alexander wasted no time. "Cut the act, Jared. We know what you did to Claire." Jared froze, his smirk faltering for the first time. "I have no idea what you're talking about." Alina stepped forward, holding up the file. "Then explain this. Explain why you were paying people to follow my mother and why you arranged for her disappearance." Jared's face darkened, and his eyes darted between Alina and Alexander. "You're making baseless accusations." Alexander slammed the file onto the table. "The evidence is right here. You tried to control her, and when she wouldn't comply, you got rid of her." For a moment, Jared seemed to consider denying everything. But then his shoulders sagged, and a flicker of vulnerability crossed his face. "She was going to ruin everything," he said quietly. "Our family's reputation, the business. She was reckless. I did what I thought was best." "What you thought was best?" Alina's voice cracked with emotion. "You destroyed lives. You destroyed her." Jared's eyes met hers, and for a brief moment, there was something that resembled regret. "She left me no choice," he said weakly. "No choice?" Alexander's voice was cold. "You chose power over family, over love, and now you'll face the consequences." As the confrontation unfolded, the weight of years of deception bore down on them. Jared's actions had caused irreparable damage, but Alina and Alexander were determined to ensure his reign of control ended here. Their journey to uncover the truth had brought pain and heartache, but it had also brought clarity and a resolve to honor Claire's memory by standing together against the darkness Jared had sown. The confrontation with Jared left a heavy silence hanging over the Carter estate. His confession, though begrudging and hollow, was enough to push forward with legal proceedings. Alexander, driven by a mixture of rage and grief, vowed to bring Jared to justice. But for Alina, the ordeal felt like the closing of one chapter and the hesitant opening of another. She had spent so long searching for answers, and now that she had them, she wasn't sure what to do with the pieces of her past. In the days that followed, Alexander worked tirelessly with his lawyers and investigators. Jared's connections and influence, which had once shielded him, began to crumble under the weight of the evidence. The media caught wind of the scandal, and Jared's name was splashed across headlines. "Justice is finally catching up with him," Alexander said one evening as he and Alina sat in the estate's study. The warm glow of the fireplace softened the tension in the room. "Justice for Claire," Alina murmured, her gaze fixed on the flames. Alexander reached over and placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "And for you, Alina, for everything you've endured because of him." As the weeks turned into months, life began to change in ways neither of them had expected. Jared faced trial, and the revelations of his crimes shocked the business world. With his downfall, Alexander became the sole figurehead of the Carter family's legacy. But instead of reveling in the power, he used his position to make amends. "We need to turn this company into something Claire would be proud of," he told Alina one morning. "A legacy built on compassion, not control." Alina admired his determination. Together, they began reworking the company's focus, funding initiatives that supported women's shelters and orphanages, honoring Claire's memory in meaningful ways. For Alina, the shift wasn't just external. The house that had once felt like a gilded prison began to feel like a home. Alexander encouraged her to pursue her dreams, enrolling her in art school to reignite the passion she had long set aside. "You don't have to feel lost anymore," he said as he handed her the acceptance letter, her eyes filled with tears. "I don't even know how to thank you." "You don't have to," he replied gently. "You've given me something I thought I'd lost forever: hope." Their bond deepened over shared memories of Claire and the quiet understanding of their shared pain. They spent evenings in the study, piecing together Claire's journals, her artwork, and the letters she'd left behind. "I think she'd be happy," Alina said one night, tracing her finger over a sketch Claire had drawn of a sunny meadow. "I think so too," Alexander agreed, his voice tinged with emotion. As time went on, Alexander found himself looking at Alina with a warmth he hadn't felt in years. It wasn't just her connection to Claire that drew him. It was her resilience, her strength, and the way she had brought light back into a house that had long been shrouded in darkness. One evening, as they stood on the estate's balcony, overlooking the sprawling gardens, Alexander spoke hesitantly. "Alina, I never thought I'd feel this way again, but I care about you, deeply." Alina turned to him, her heart racing. "Alexander, She paused, searching for the right words. "I know this is complicated," he continued, "but I want you to know that you're not alone anymore. Whatever the future holds, I hope we can face it together." Her lips curved into a soft smile. "You've given me a place to belong, Alexander, and for that, I'll always be grateful." Months later, the estate was alive with activity. The gardens were adorned with twinkling lights, and the air buzzed with the laughter and chatter of guests. Alexander and Alina had decided to host a charity gala to celebrate the launch of their new foundation, the Claire Initiative, dedicated to supporting underprivileged families and children. As they stood side by side, addressing the crowd, Alexander took a moment to reflect on how far they had come. "This isn't just about honoring Claire's memory," he said, his voice strong and clear. "It's about building a future she would have believed in. And it's about the people who make that possible. People like Alina." The audience erupted into applause, and Alina felt a surge of pride. Later that evening, as the guests danced under the stars, Alexander and Alina stole a quiet moment in the garden. "You've changed everything," he said softly, taking her hand. "So have you," she replied. As they stood there, the past no longer felt like a weight, but a foundation. Together, they had turned pain into purpose, and for the first time in a long time, the future felt bright. Years later, the Claire Initiative had become a beacon of hope for countless families. Alina, now an accomplished artist and advocate, worked closely with Alexander to expand their efforts globally. On the anniversary of Claire's disappearance, they visited her favorite spot on the estate, a small pond surrounded by wild flowers. "We did it, Claire," Alexander said quietly, placing a bouquet of her favorite flowers on the ground. "We found a way to honor you." Alina knelt beside him, her hand resting on his shoulder. "And we'll keep going," she added, "for you and for everyone who needs hope." As they stood together, watching the sunlight dance on the water, they knew they had turned tragedy into something beautiful, a testament to love, resilience, and the unbreakable bond of family. Thank you for listening to this story. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more inspiring tales like this one. What do you think about this journey of resilience, love, and second chances? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear from you.